This is K.M. Weiland, and you are listening to the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode, Archetypal Antagonists for the King Arc, Cataclysm and Rebel. The King Arc begins the second half of the life cycle of archetypal character arcs. This placement as the fourth of 6 arcs necessarily makes it a turning point within the overarching story structure of life. We can recognize this particularly in the king's relationship to his archetypal antagonists. The first 3 arcs, those of Maiden, Hero, and Queen, are primarily concerned with gaining power. The final 3 arcs, those of King, Crone, and Mage, are primarily concerned with surrendering power. As such, the early arcs often demonstrate comparatively narrow and dualistic views of the antagonistic forces that oppose them. For the young maiden, the entire thrust of her transformation is that of individuating from authority and becoming a separate person. The hero then faces a dehumanized antagonistic force represented by the dragon. And the queen, although beginning to recognize her antagonist of Invader as her equal, she still pushes back with an us versus them mindset. By the time we reach the challenges of the King arc, however, this relationship to the antagonist begins to dramatically shift. The central challenge of the King arc is that of recognizing a larger realm of power and potential beyond the physical sphere on which he has so far spent all his focus. As the successful ruler of a vast kingdom, and indeed perhaps even an empire, he has necessarily moved beyond the queen's small us versus them mindset to recognize the interconnectedness of all the subjects within his realm, and indeed himself with them. In King, Warrior, Magician, Lover, Robert Moore and Douglas Gillette note, the good king always mirrored and affirmed others who deserved it. He did this by seeing them, in a literal sense, in his audiences at the palace, and in the psychological sense of noticing them, knowing them in their true worth. The good king delighted in noticing and promoting good men to positions of responsibility within his kingdom. He held audience primarily not to be seen, although this was important to the extent that he carried people's own projected inner king energy, but to see, admire, and delight in his subjects, to reward them, and to bestow honors upon them. Therefore, it is interesting to observe that the king's archetypal antagonists are much more connected to him, and that indeed much of his arc is about recognizing and even blessing this connection. The king faces the archetypal antagonists of Cataclysm and Rebel, both of which present challenges that ask him to culminate his rule in a way that blesses his kingdom, even as he himself must journey on into the misty and liminal spaces of the third act of elderhood. As ever, the entire concept of archetypal antagonists is rooted in deeply symbolic language. In an equally symbolic story, such as those in the fantasy genre, these antagonists may be realized literally. But in our more realistic stories, such as those set in the modern world, these antagonistic forces can be recognized as just that, forces. The Cataclysm, particularly, is a force. It represents a supernatural power descending upon the kingdom and demanding the king evolve his tactics. Up to this point, the king has successfully defended his kingdom from any number of natural enemies. In essence, he began his career back when he was the queen, staving off the threat of invaders from without. Up to now, his strong right arm and the sword of his mind have proven more than capable of dealing with all comers. But the advent of the Cataclysm signals that he is being called into his next arc. Much like the invaders in the previous Queen arc, the Cataclysm represents a threat from beyond, and therefore one that creates the external conflict within the plot. Meanwhile, it is the king's own subjects who represent the threat from within the kingdom, as the rebels, disgruntled by the changing times, still lacking in maturity, and frightened of this cataclysm which they are as yet even less equipped to comprehend. As with all of the primary and external antagonists within these arcs, the Cataclysm is foundationally the reason the protagonist is being challenged to undertake this stage in his evolution. If this challenge were never to arrive and alter the status quo, there would be no reason, and arguably no ability, for the character to change. The Cataclysm represents a particularly powerful antagonistic force. Partly this is due to its awesomely destructive nature. As the first of the spiritual antagonists, followed by the Death Blight in the Crone arc and Evil in the Mage arc, the Cataclysm inevitably feels a bit apocalyptic. And mostly this is due to its unprecedented and therefore unknown nature. This is like nothing the protagonist has faced before. Or more practically, it is something against which all the old successful methods will not work. More personally to the king, the Cataclysm simply represents the turning of the tide within his own life. He is growing older, he is approaching the end of his physical vigor, and even though old age and death may yet be decades in the future, he is now closer to his death than to his birth. And so, although the Cataclysm may indeed be represented as a supernatural force, it may also be represented in a quieter or more realistic story as simply the character's need to grapple with the end of an era within his job or his family life. In the beginning of the story, the king will see the Cataclysm as an enemy, perhaps even accepting a narrative in which this force is malignant and deliberately out to get him or his subjects. Because his story is one in which he is being asked to leave his throne, willingly or not, he will have to acknowledge and deal with feelings of resistance and resentment. But if he succeeds in facing this antagonist, he will come to realize its antagonism is not personal. Indeed, the Cataclysm is a supernatural force. Even though its consequences are frightening, it is in fact a messenger warning the king of changes that must be made if the balance of his own and his subjects' health is to be maintained. Symbolically, the only way to defeat the Cataclysm and protect the kingdom from its threatened apocalypse is for the king to sacrifice himself to restore balance. The Cataclysm is not out to get him. Rather, it is offering him the opportunity to avoid destruction. As such, the king will come to realize the Cataclysm is less an enemy than a strange friend. So why does the king have to give up his throne anyway? A true king is a good king, so it seems like we should keep him on his throne for as long as possible, right? First of all, keep in mind that just because someone reaches the true and archetypal stage of ruler, in the positive sense, this does not mean he will ever be called to take the king arc. Many people will spend their elder years as the ruler, never taking the crone or mage arcs, and some people never make it to the ruler at all. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, since whether or not someone is called to take these archetypal arcs can depend largely on contextual social needs. No one person's archetypal journeys take place within a vacuum. But if the king is indeed called upon this transformative journey in which the Cataclysm signals an impending and destructive imbalance within the kingdom, it is likely because it is time for his young subjects to rise into their own roles of leadership. If the king were to refuse to step aside to make way for the new queens, and by extension, if he were to refuse to take his own initiations into elderhood, and therefore be incapable of further initiating the younger maidens and heroes, he would block the growth of the overall kingdom. Stagnation and rot would set in. In other words, cataclysm. We can see the results of this failure on the king's part in that he often shows up in the negative shadow aspect of tyrant in Queen stories. But we also see his inner conflict with this reality even within his own successful arc. In any king arc, younger characters will be prominent and important. If the king's story is about leaving the throne, then there must be someone to whom he passes the crown. Worthy heroes and queens who will benefit from his stalwart legacy. But there will also be rebels. These characters represent an antagonistic force within the kingdom, catalyzed by the fearsome cataclysm, which they, unlike the true king, lack the wisdom to understand. They distrust the king's responses to this emergency. The rebels ultimately represent that part of the king's psyche that also wants to rebel against this new reality that seeks power by any means. Externalized, the rebels deepen the complexity of the narrative by providing a convincing argument for the king not to abandon his throne and sacrifice himself to the cataclysm. After all, these rowdy upstarts are clearly unready to replace him in all his wisdom and experience. Depending on the nature of the story, the rebels may be redeemed into worthy successors, or they may be defeated by those among the king's subjects who are worthy to take up his crown. Usually, the cataclysm will represent the outer conflict, the main problem the protagonist is trying to solve. This could be a literal apocalypse, or it could be the dissolution of the character's business, or it could be an illness, such as cancer or Alzheimer's, that is threatening the character's previous mode of life. Almost always, the cataclysm will be presented as something abstract. The enemy will not be human, even if it employs a human army. Or alternatively, the mastermind might be a mortal who unwittingly wields a supernatural power he does not fully understand and which escapes the leash. The cataclysm is a deep existential problem, but it is not a person or group of people who can be easily vilified. By contrast, the rebels are almost always human characters who are close to the king. Once again, while the cataclysm represents the antagonist, the rebels are more likely to represent the contagonist, a force that is not directly opposed to the king, but which starts out seemingly aligned with him only to try to tempt him off his true path. The rebels offer much opportunity for thematic complexity and depth, since they can be represented by both shadow archetypes, but also positive but simply immature archetypes. Although the rebels may indeed be aggressive shadow archetypes, such as bullies and sorceresses, who wish to usurp the power of the throne for their own means, they may also simply be young upstarts who don't yet know that they don't know. Ultimately, all varieties of rebels are the king's subjects, and he will feel an alignment with them and a call to protect and serve them. It is very possible for even far gone rebels to be redeemed by the king's sacrifice in the end, such as we see literally in C.S. Lewis's allegory, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. The climactic moment in a king's story will be his sacrifice, that moment when he surrenders himself to the warning of the cataclysm and gives his life to right the balance of his kingdom. Depending on how the rebels are represented within the story, this sacrifice on the king's part may instantly redeem them, or defeat them. But it's also possible the rebels will be dealt with in the climax by those of the king's younger subjects who have remained faithful, his heroes and queens. It's also possible the rebels will not be dealt with until after the climactic moment, as more of a loose end in the resolution. And this may be especially true if the king literally dies and the new queen/king must deal with the rebels in the aftermath. Although the more dualistic and simplistic relationship between the younger archetypes of maiden, hero, and queen and their antagonists is valid and important, the king arc can be a good choice if you're wanting to explore a different take on good versus evil in your stories. The king's increasingly complex relationship with his antagonists offers much grist for thematic exploration. And on that note, stay tuned because next week we will study the archetypal antagonists of the crone, the Deathblight, and the Tempter. And in the meantime, I hope you'll stop by the site and tell me your opinion. Can you think of any examples of the Cataclysm and the Rebel as archetypal antagonists? If you'd like to be part of the word player community over on my site and join in the conversation on this subject, be sure to stop by the website at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com. You can always find a transcript of the most recent podcast and add your voice to the discussion by visiting the first post on the site's homepage. And don't forget that if you're looking for an older post, you can always find those by putting the podcast title in the search field at the top of the right-hand column. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe on Apple Podcast, Spotify, and Amazon Music, or whatever your favorite podcast platform may be. And if you'd like to do something to support helping writers become authors, it always means a ton if you're able to leave just a quick rating or review on your site of choice. Also, many thanks to those who support my work on Patreon. Your patronage helps make Helping Writers Become Authors and its many resources available to writers everywhere. If you're interested in becoming a patron, you can find out more at patreon.com/kmweiland. Thank you so much for listening to the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast, and be sure to check back again next week.